The broker's cart threw a wheel 4 miles back, and the driver had not offered to wait. Vora walked the rest of it. The dry grass country gave her nothing to look at but itself, bruise-colored in the failing light, flat enough that she could see the ranch materialize out of the dusk a full 10 minutes before she reached it. She used the time, peeling paint on the main house, barn in better repair, water trough with frost already forming at the edges, which meant the trough was in a low spot and the cold settled there first, which meant the ground around it would be mud by spring and someone would need to regrade it. One light in the house window, one horse in the near paddock, a roan, well fed. The fence line on the south side had 3 posts that leaned the same direction, which was wind damage, not neglect. She filed all of it and kept walking. The porch steps were sound. The board at the top was not. Her boot caught the nail on the way up, and she pulled free without stumbling. But she looked down and marked it. 3rd board, left side, nail head proud by a 1/4 inch, wood soft around it, which meant the nail had been pulling loose for a while and nobody had noticed or nobody had gotten around to it. She did not look at it again. She knocked. The man who opened the door was holding a coffee mug in a way that suggested he had forgotten it was there. He was tall, worn thin in the way of men who work outdoors and don't eat enough, wearing a shirt that had once been blue and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He looked at her the way a man looks at incoming weather. Not afraid, not welcoming, and just reading the situation for what it was. His eyes moved to the pack on her back, then to the broker's papers she was already holding out, then to her face. "I didn't send for anyone, Martem," he said. The broker disagrees. She kept her voice flat. It was not difficult. Flat was where she lived when she was reading a new place, and she was still reading this one. Callan Durst, Harrow Creek. Work request filed 8 months ago, advance paid, placement confirmed 3 days back. She turned the top page toward him so he could see his own name. The broker's cart is 4 miles east with a broken wheel. I walked on B. He looked at the paper for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. She came in. The kitchen was the first room, a working kitchen, not a show of one, and with the smell of coffee and old wood smoke, and something underneath that she catalogued without meaning to as a room where someone cooked for 2 and had not yet learned to cook for 1. The stove was good iron, well maintained. The table had 2 chairs. On the shelf above the stove, 2 plates were stacked, one in front of the other. She counted them once and looked at the window instead. He set his mug down and pulled out the near chair. Not for her. He sat in it himself, which she noted as a man who was not performing hospitality, which was more honest than performance would have been. He nodded at the other chair. She sat. "Or work is cattle," he said. 20 head. South pasture fence needs attention. Vegetable plot bought. He paused. "And house say, I have medical training Geshawoing," she said. "Field medicine and herbalism, not magic. But learn tarted." She put her hands flat on the table, both of them, the straight left and the crooked right, 2 fingers healed at the wrong angle after someone had decided to make a point with them. She did not explain the fingers. She did not hide them. "You don't need to use it. You should know it's there." He looked at her hands for a moment, not at the crooked fingers specifically, at her hands the way a man looks at tools, assessing what they could do. "A wage," he said, "or room and board plus coin, in writing." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite not one. He got up and opened the drawer beside the stove and looked into it for a while. Then he checked his shirt pocket. Then he went to the shelf on the far wall and moved 3 things before he found the pencil behind them. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned that the quality of a man's character showed itself most clearly in the moments he didn't know he was being observed, and a man who looked for a pencil in 3 places without getting frustrated was a man who was used to the small indignities of living alone and had made a kind of peace with them. He came back to the table and wrote the terms on the back of the broker's paper in a hand that was plain and even. Wage, room, board, 30-day trial. He pushed it across to her. She read it, which took her less time than it would have taken most people, and then she signed her name below his and pushed it back. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket without looking at it again. "Room's off the kitchen," he said. "She small domci, sir, I've had smaller." She did not elaborate. But the room was small and cold and had a window that faced north, which meant cold mornings, but also meant she could see the approach from the trail. She checked that the window opened before she put her pack down, lifted the latch, pushed the frame, felt the resistance, and then the give. It opened. She closed it again. The paint on the sill was peeling in long strips, the wood beneath it grey and dry but sound when she pressed her thumb against it. She stood in the dark for a while, listening to the house settle around her. His footsteps in the kitchen, deliberate, unhurried. The sound of the coffee pot moved. A cabinet opened and closed. Then quiet, and then his door. She looked at the frost on the glass. The roan in the paddock was a dark shape against the dark. The barn was a solid mass, better kept than the house, and she had already decided she would start there in the morning. When she went back to the kitchen for water, she found a second mug on the counter beside the coffee pot. It had not been there before. It was not an invitation. There was no note, no gesture, no announcement. It was simply a mug placed where she could find it if she wanted it, by a man who had already gone to bed. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she pressed her right hand flat against the counter, the crooked fingers and the straight ones both, testing the surface the way she tested everything. Not for comfort, but for whether it would hold. It held. Broke things still run, she thought. She was talking about herself. She was not talking about the ranch, not yet. The barn was dark when she got there, or not fully. The east wall had a gap where a board had warped away from its neighbor, and the pre-dawn grey came through in a single pale stripe across the hay, but dark enough that she'd had to wait a moment at the threshold for her eyes to adjust before she moved. She did not move until she could see clearly. That was a rule she'd kept for years, and she saw no reason to stop keeping it now. The heifer was in the third stall. Vora had noticed her the night before. The way she'd been standing with her weight shifted, one foreleg bearing less than it should, the angle of her hip compensating for something lower down. Nobody had pointed this out. Nobody had needed to. Vora had simply filed it alongside everything else she'd filed on arrival. The nail in the porch, the 2 plates, the window latch that needed lifting before it would catch. Things that needed attention. Things she would get to in order. She found the supply shelf on her first pass of the barn. It was organized with a logic she recognized. Not alphabetical, not by size, but by frequency of use. The things reached for most often were at the front. The things reached for in emergencies were at eye level. Someone had thought about this. She noted that too. The compress took her 10 minutes to prepare. Dried comfrey from the 3rd jar, bruised and soaked in the water she carried from the house, in a tin cup, bound in a strip of clean cloth she cut from the hem of her spare shirt, because the barn's rag supply was too rough for a joint already inflamed. She worked by the stripe of grey light and by feel, her crooked fingers moving through the familiar sequence, without needing to be told what came next. The heifer stood for it with the exhausted patience of an animal who had been hurting long enough to accept help from whatever direction it arrived. She was tying off the second wrap when she heard Callan's boots on the barn floor. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up. She knew where he was by the change in the draft and the particular silence of a man who has stopped moving because he is watching something he didn't expect to find. "How'd you know the shelf was there?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "The barn is better organized than the house." She tied the last knot and ran her thumb along the edge of the wrap to check the tension. "So I started here." He came the rest of the way in. I stood on the other side of the heifer and looked at the compress the way he'd looked at her last night, assessing, not recoiling. His hands, she noticed, were wrapped around each other in front of him. Not cold. Something else. Fetlock, she said. Swelling's been there at least 4 days. She's been compensating in the hip. You'll see it when she walks. And I saw it, he said. She looked up at that. He was looking at the heifer, not at her. Didn't know what to do for it, he said. He said it the way a man states a fact he doesn't enjoy stating. Now you do. She stood, her knees registering the cold floor, and picked up the tin cup. I'll check it again tonight. If the swelling's down by half, she's fine. If it isn't, there's something deeper, and I'll need to look closer. He nodded. That was all. But they worked the south fence through the morning. The posts were sound, but 3 of the rails had gone soft with rot, and the work was straightforward. Pull the bad wood, cut the new lengths, set them, and nail them true. Callan worked from the east end. Vora worked from the west. They met in the middle around the time the sun got high enough to take the worst edge off the cold, and by then they had established, without discussing it, a rhythm that didn't require discussion. He was efficient. She matched his pace. When he moved to the next post, she moved to the next post. When he stopped to check a rail's alignment, she waited without filling the silence with anything. The silence, she had decided, was not unfriendly. It was just the shape of the work. At midday he opened his canteen and she saw it. The slight tremor in both hands as he unscrewed the cap. The way he wrapped his fingers around the metal body and held it until the shaking passed. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. She had already catalogued it on the first night. The way he'd held his mug, and she had filed it then as she filed it now. Not drink, not cold, not age. Something that lived in the nervous system. Something old. She drank from her own canteen and looked at the fence line. The vegetable plot was in worse shape than the fence. The frost had been at it for 2 weeks, and the last of the summer growth had gone to mush at the edges. But the root vegetables were still sound, and the dried herb bundles she'd found tied to the fence stakes, someone's work from earlier in the season, neat and deliberate, were worth salvaging. She worked through the afternoon pulling what could be pulled, turning the soil over the rest to protect it through the winter, replanting the herb stakes at the south end where the wall of the house would break the worst of the wind. She did not think about the nail while she was working, but when she passed the porch on her way back to the barn with the last of the herb bundles, she stopped. Looked at the board. Looked at the nail head, standing just proud of the wood, angled wrong, the kind of thing that would catch a boot heel for another 10 years if nobody dealt with it. She set down the herb bundles, found a hammer in the barn, pulled the nail, turned it, reset it flush and true in 30 seconds, put the hammer back, picked up the herb bundles, went inside. She left no evidence of it, and that was not calculation. She simply had no interest in announcing the thing. It was a nail. It needed fixing. It was fixed. Pip found her in the garden just before she finished. He came around the corner of the house with the slow, considered gait of a dog whose joints had opinions, and sat down beside her left boot with the gravity of a magistrate who had reviewed the evidence and reached a verdict. She looked at him. He looked at the middle distance. "All right, she said. He did not move. Callan, coming down from the fence line with the last of the pulled rails over his shoulder, stopped at the garden gate. He looked at the dog. He looked at Vora. "He doesn't do that," he said. "He just did." Callan set the rails against the fence post and looked at Pip for another moment. Pip remained committed to his position. Callan said. He picked up the rails and went to the woodpile. That evening she sat at the kitchen table doing the day's accounts in her head, the cost of the compress materials against the heifer's value, the fence rails against the south pasture lease, the herb bundles against the winter stores, while Pip lay across her feet with the full weight of his conviction. Callan's light was on across the hall. She could hear him moving, the particular rhythm of a man doing the small tasks of an evening alone. Boots set down, water poured, the creak of the chair he always chose. She heard him stop, a pause, longer than the others. Then the sound of a plate being set on the shelf. Then, after a moment, a second plate set beside it. She looked at the ceiling. Pip's breathing was slow and even against her boots, while neither of them said good night. The light across the hall stayed on a while longer. She did not mind. The wagon seat was narrow and Callan drove with both hands on the reins, which left Vora the back of the wagon and the empty crates and 4 miles of dry grass country, going grey in the early light. She sat with her spine against the sideboards and watched the land move past. Frost still on the low places. The grass the colour of old bone. A hawk working the thermals above the creek bed, patient and entirely without sentiment about what it was looking for. She had her medicine satchel between her feet. Habit. She did not go to Tallow River without it, the same way she did not sleep without knowing where the door was. Callan had not said anything since they left the ranch. She had not said anything either. Feed the silence had the quality of weather. Present, not hostile, not requiring a response. She had catalogued this about him in the first week. He did not fill silence to manage other people's comfort. Most humans did. It was one of the things she had learned to brace for, the way you brace for a gate that swings hard. With Callan, it did not swing. She had stopped bracing. Tallow River materialized the way small frontier towns did. A water tower first, then a feed store, then the rest of it arriving in a cluster as though it had been waiting around the bend. Callan pulled the wagon up beside the post and dry goods and climbed down without ceremony. He said he'd be at the feed store and she should take the supply list to Della. He handed her the list and the money in the same motion, already turning, already thinking about the next thing. And she watched him go. His hands were in his coat pockets. He did that when he wasn't carrying something. Put his hands away, like tools he was storing between uses. She had noticed the shaking. She had not mentioned it. It was not her information to have. Inside the post, Della Marsh was already pulling flour from the back shelf before Vora had cleared the doorway. The woman had a memory like a ledger. She kept accounts in her head the way Vora did, which was the first thing Vora had respected about her. Harrow Creek order, Della said, not a question. She set the flour on the counter and took the list from Vora's hand, reading it with the quick efficiency of someone who had read 10,000 lists and found them all equally straightforward. She did not look at Vora the way most people in Tallow River did. There was no half-second recalibration, no brief inventory of the green skin and the tusks and the crooked fingers, before the eyes settled somewhere neutral. Della looked at her the way she looked at the list, directly, for the purpose of getting the information she needed. "How are you finding the Harrow Creek place?" Della said, not a question either. The woman spoke in statements and let you decide whether to answer. "Sound," Vora said. Della set a sack of salt on the counter beside the flour. "That's more than most say." Vora waited. There was more coming. She could hear it in the way Della's hand slowed slightly on the next item. "He wasn't always this quiet," Della said. She kept moving, pulling the order, not looking up. "Had a wife, Maren, good woman. She used to come in for the post herself most weeks. Talked enough for both of them. A pause. Caught fever took her, and the baby, same week. Another pause, shorter. That was 2 years and some months ago. He hasn't had anyone at that ranch since." She set the last item on the counter and looked up. Her face was not soft about it. It was the face of a woman who had delivered difficult information before and understood that softening it did not make it easier to carry. "I'm not telling you what to do with it," Della said. "I'm just making sure you have the facts." Vora looked at the supplies on the counter. She thought about the 2 plates on the shelf. The one he put away without eating from. She had counted it every morning and filed it without comment. The way she filed everything that was not her information to have. "Thank you." she said. Della nodded and began wrapping the order. Outside, Vora loaded the crates into the wagon while Callan was still at the feed store. She moved the heavier items to the front for balance, the way she always did, without thinking about it. When Callan came back, he looked at the loaded wagon and then looked at her, and she could see him registering that she had done it correctly. Not surprised, just noting it, the way he noted everything useful. They were 2 miles out of town when he asked, "How'd you come to know medicine?" He was looking at the road. His hands were on the reins, not in his pockets. She answered in the register she used for fax. I was the clan's record keeper. The record keeper tracked what people needed. What they needed most often was not to die. The wagon moved, and a crow crossed the road ahead of them and was gone into the grass. "What happened to the record keeping was he said, and I found a discrepancy in the accounts." "What kind?" "The kind where children went hungry so the war chief could eat well." She looked at the road. "And I brought it to the elders. The war chief moved faster than I did." She held up her right hand. The 2 crooked fingers, healed wrong, the knuckles still thickened. She did not explain them. She put her hand back in her lap. Callan looked at her hand for a moment. Then he looked back at the road. The reins moved slightly in his grip, a small adjustment for a rut he had seen before she had. "I'm sorry that happened," he said. "Not that's terrible. Not those people. Not the performance of outrage that people offered sometimes, which was really just a way of making themselves feel clean." He said, "I'm sorry that happened," the way he said everything, the essential words, and then he stopped. She did not need him to say anything else. They rode the last 2 miles without speaking. The dry grass country came back around them. The hawk gone now, the sky the flat white of a day that had decided not to commit to weather. When Callan pulled the wagon into the barn, the light was already going amber and low. He climbed down and came around to the back. He lifted a crate and held it out to her. She took the other end. Their hands were briefly around the same object, his, shaking slightly in the cold, wrapped around the crate's edge. Hers, the right one with its crooked fingers, taking the weight without adjustment, because she had always taken weight this way, and because the fingers worked even if they did not work straight. Neither of them commented on this. The crate got carried in. On the counter beside the supply bags, Vora found a small jar she had not packed. Dried willow bark, no label, no note. She picked it up. She looked at Della's handwriting on the lid, just the contents, nothing else, and understood that it had been slipped into the order without being put on the bill. The jar was small. The gesture was smaller. It was for the morning stiffness in her fingers, which she had not mentioned to anyone. She set it on the kitchen shelf beside her medicine satchel. She did not mention it to Callan. She did not mention it to herself. Not in any way that counted. She simply put it where she could reach it. Outside, the last of the light left the barn roof. Les Callan was still moving in the barn, putting the horses up. She could hear him talking to them. Low, practical, the same tone he used for everything. She had noticed he talked to the animals the way other men talk to people. She had not asked about this either. She began putting the supplies away. The willow bark stayed on the shelf. The frost came in the night without announcement, the way the worst things do. Vora knew it before she opened her eyes. The quality of the cold had changed. It had weight now, a density that pressed against the window glass and turned the light, coming under the door, from grey to something closer to white. She lay still for a moment with her hands flat on the blanket, feeling the temperature in her knuckles, in the crooked fingers that always knew the weather before the weather arrived. Then she got up, but the garden was already gone. She understood that before she reached the door. 3 weeks of careful management, the late carrots she'd hilled up, the turnips she'd left another week because they'd wanted it, the herb bundles she'd been drying on the fence stakes, and one night had settled the question. She pulled her coat on and went out anyway. because understanding a loss and accounting for it are different things, and she had always been better at the accounting. The ground was iron under her boots. Her breath came out white and disappeared. She moved through the garden rows in the early dark, pressing her fingers into the soil at the base of each plant, reading what the frost had taken and what it had only threatened. The turnips had held, the carrots most of them. The herb bundles on the stakes were stiff but intact. She'd hung them high enough that the ground frost hadn't reached. She worked without a lamp because she didn't need one, her hands knowing the difference between a plant that had given up and one that was only cold. By the time the sky had lightened enough to call it morning, she had salvaged what could be saved. She carried it inside in her coat, making 3 trips, and laid it out on the kitchen table in rows. Turnips to the left, carrots beside them, the herb bundles at the far end sorted by what would keep longest. She stood back and looked at it. Not a disaster. A setback that had been managed. There was a difference, and she had learned over the years to find the difference before she found the grief. She heard his boots on the porch. Callan stopped in the kitchen doorway with his coat still open, the cold coming in around him. He looked at the table. He looked at it for a long time. The rows, the sorting, the evidence of work done before he'd woken, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name and didn't try to. His hands, she noticed, were already wrapped around each other, the left gripping the right at the wrist. The morning habit. He did it without seeming to know he was doing it. "I'll make breakfast," he said. She sat down at the table. She did not offer to help, because she had learned in 3 weeks that Callan Durst's kitchen was one of the few places where he still moved without hesitation, where his hands knew what to do before he told them, and she had no intention of standing in the way of that. She watched him from the corner of her eye the way she watched everything. Not staring, just keeping track. He cracked eggs with the economy of a man who had done it 10,000 times. The salt pork went into the pan with a sound like a decision being made. He worked the stove with his back to her, and she looked at the salvage on the table and did the calculation she'd been doing since she came inside. What would keep through winter? What needed to be used in the next week? What she could dry and what she could store in the cold cellar. The numbers arranged themselves in her head without effort. They always had. He put a plate in front of her without ceremony. Eggs and salt pork and a heel of bread she hadn't known was left. He put a plate in front of himself and sat down. She watched him reach toward the shelf above the stove. The small automatic reach, the one she'd seen every morning, the one that ended with a plate coming down and then going back, and then stop. His hand stayed in the air for a half second. Then he put it back on the table and picked up his fork. He did not put the 3rd plate down. He did not put it away. He simply did not take it from the shelf. Vora looked at her food. She ate. The eggs were good. He cooked them the way she preferred, which she had not told him, which meant he had noticed. She filed this away with the other things she had filed about Callan Durst. The second mug left on the counter the first night. The nail on the porch board that had been reset without discussion. But the way he'd looked at her crooked fingers on the wagon ride back from Tallow River and said, "I'm sorry that happened," and then let it be done. The morning was quiet in the way mornings at Harrow Creek were quiet. Not empty, just unhurried. Wind against the north wall. The stove ticking as it worked. Outside, somewhere, one of the cattle making the low sound they made when they wanted nothing in particular. Pip came in from wherever he slept and crossed the kitchen with the slow authority of a dog who had decided the terms of his own life some years ago. He passed Callan without stopping. He came to the bench beside Vora and stood there for a moment, assessing, and then put his grey muzzle in her lap with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "He doesn't do that," Callan said. I know." She put her hand on the dog's head. The fur was coarse and warm. "And how do you know?" "For you told me. In the barn. 2 weeks ago." He turned and looked at her. Not the sideways assessment he usually gave, but an actual look, direct. the kind that meant he had stopped doing something else in order to do it. She held it without expression. His face was doing something she didn't have a word for yet, something that had to do with being seen and not minding it, which was different from the way most people experienced being seen. He turned back to his plate. "'Sh reckon I did," he said. She drank her coffee. Pip did not move from her lap. The kitchen held the warmth of the stove, and the smell of salt pork, and the particular stillness of two people who have stopped bracing for the other one to do something wrong. After, she washed the plates and left them on the rack. She brewed a second pot, her own blend, the one with the dried chamomile, and the small amount of valerian she'd found in the barn supply shelf. The one that did nothing dramatic, but settled the nervous system the way a hand on a nervous animal's neck settles it. She poured a mug and left it beside the coffee pot without comment. Not because he was sick, because the morning was cold and his hands had been shaking since he woke up, and she had what was needed, and there was no reason not to use it. She went back to the table and looked at the salvage. She began to plan. Behind her, she heard him pick up the mug. She heard him drink. He didn't ask what it was. Through the window, the frost-killed garden lay flat and grey in the morning light. The turnips were in, the carrots were in, the herbs were hanging in the kitchen now, and above the stove where the warmth would finish drying them. On the table, the salvage was sorted and counted and accounted for. Callan stood at the window with his mug, looking out at the dead garden. Behind him, the table had 2 plates on it, both dirty, both used. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. The frost had come in the night without announcement. Some things had held anyway. The supply list was short. 4 items written in Callan's hand on the back of a seed envelope: flour, lamp oil, a new file for the fence posts, and salt. Vora read it twice on the road, not because she needed to, but because she was alone for the first time in 3 weeks, and the habit of checking things twice was one she'd earned. The horse Callan had given her was a grey mare named Nothing in particular. He called her the Grey. She called her Nothing at all, and the mare seemed unbothered by both. The road to Tallow River ran flat through the dry grass country. The sky above it the colour of old pewter, the grass on either side gone the colour of a bruise. Frost still in the low places at mid-morning. The cold sat in Vora's crooked fingers and she flexed them against the reins, one at a time, the way she did every morning until the stiffness loosened into something workable. She was thinking about the heifer's fetlock. Sound now, the swelling gone, the animal moving without favouring it, when she rode into Tallow River and tied the mare at Della's post. Della had the flour already pulled before Vora finished reading the list aloud. That was Della's way. She listened to the first item and her hands were already moving before the second. "Files in the back," Della said. "Lamp oil's where it always is. Salt's low. I can give you half what you need today, and the rest Thursday if you're coming back through." "I'll take what you have," Vora said. "We'll manage the rest." Della nodded and went to the back. Vora stood at the counter and looked at the goods on the shelves, the organized rows of tins and paper packages, the careful handwritten labels, the small practical world of a woman who had made order out of frontier chaos and intended to keep it that way. She respected it without needing to say so. The bell above the door rang and a man came in, broad through the chest, red-faced from the cold, wearing a coat that had been expensive once. He nodded at Vora with the half-second recalibration she was used to, then moved past it faster than most. "She Howell," Della said, coming back with the file. "De Della, Dom." He set a list on the counter and looked at Vora again, not unkindly. "You're out at the Harrow Creek place." "Yes," Vora said. "Durst's outfit." He shook his head, and the shake had something in it she couldn't immediately classify. Not contempt, not pity. Something closer to bafflement. Shame that, man living like he does. Vora looked at him. She kept her voice flat. "How does he live?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement with a space at the end of it, and Howell walked into the space the way people did when they assumed everyone already knew what they were about to say. Broke as a church mouse way he acts, paying his fence bills in installments, buying flour by the quarter sack. Howell picked up a tin from the counter and turned it over. Given the Durst land holdings up north, I mean. His daddy's land. That whole tract above the river bend. Must be, what, Della, 300 acres of prime grazing. Della said nothing. She was looking at the file in her hands. Vora said, "Phew, what land holdings?" Howell blinked. He looked at her. He looked at Della. Something in his face shifted. The particular expression of a man who has just understood that he has said something he shouldn't have to someone who didn't already know it. "The Durst family land," he said, more carefully. "North of the valley. His father's. Callan inherited it when the old man passed." He set the tin down. 4 years back, maybe. Vora said nothing. She was counting backward in her head. 4 years ago, which was 1 year before Maren died, which meant Callan had inherited the land and then lost his wife and then, apparently, stopped existing in any direction that wasn't straight down. Howell collected his list and his dignity and left. Della waited until the bell stopped moving. Then she said, quietly, "He's not wrong about the land. 340 acres, last I heard. Good grazing, good water access. His father had lease agreements with 2 cattle operations north of the valley. Those leases would have transferred." She put the flour on the counter. "I don't think Callan's collected a payment in 3 years. Vora looked at the flour. "Why not?" "Because it was Maren's plan," Della said. The Northland. That's where they were going to build. The real place, she called it. The Harrow Creek house was always meant to be temporary. She paused. After she died, I think he just left it. Left it the way you leave a room you can't go into yet. Vora picked up the flour. It was the right weight. She put it in the bag. "He's not hiding it from you," Della said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't think he's hiding it from anyone. I think he's hiding it from himself." Vora paid for the supplies. She did not say anything else. Della, as she was handing over the change, tucked something small into the top of the bag. A twist of paper, the kind that held hard candy, the kind with no practical value at all. Vora saw her do it and did not comment. She put the bag on the mare and rode out. She found the candy somewhere past the 2nd-mile marker, her hand going into the bag for the salt to check the weight. She unwrapped it without stopping the horse and put it in her mouth. It was honey-flavored and slightly stale and entirely unnecessary. She ate it anyway. The sweetness sat on the back of her tongue and she let it. By the time she rode into the Harrow Creek yard, she had arranged the information into something she could carry without dropping it. She put the mare in the barn, unloaded the supplies onto the kitchen table, and went to find Callan. He was in the barn, checking the south pasture gate hinge. He'd been meaning to replace it for a week, and she knew by now that when something bothered him, he eventually ran out of ways to not fix it. He looked up when she came in. His hands were wrapped around the gatepost, the way he held things when the shaking was worse. She said, "Tell me about the Northland." He went still. Not the stillness of a man caught, the stillness of a man who has been expecting a door to open and has been hoping it wouldn't. "How'd you hear?" he said. Her howl, at Della's. He let go of the gatepost. He looked at the ground for a moment. Then he said, without dressing it, "It was Maren's plan, where we were going to build. I can't, He stopped. He tried again. "I can't use it for something else, and I can't sell it, so I've left it." Vora looked at him. She looked at his hands, which were not shaking right now because they were pressed flat against his thighs. "That's not broke," she said. "That's hidden. There's a difference." He didn't answer. He looked at her for a moment, actually looked the way he rarely did, the way that cost him something. And then he looked away. She went inside. In the stone that had been sitting in her chest since Tallow River was still there, but it had changed shape. It was smaller. It was heavier. She wasn't sure yet which of those things mattered more. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see him still standing at the gate in the cold, his hands at his sides, not fixing anything. The rider came out of the grey morning like something the weather had been carrying for a while, and finally set down. Vora saw him from the barn. She had been checking the heifer's fetlock, nearly healed now, the swelling gone to nothing, the leg sound under her fingers, and she straightened up and watched through the gap in the barn doors as the man came down the trail at a walk, leading a second horse behind him. The second horse was the detail that mattered. A man leading a second horse was either expecting to bring something back or expecting to leave something behind. She filed this and watched his hands on the reins. Steady, unhurried. The hands of a man who had done this before and found it unremarkable. He was Orc, large, clan-marked along the left jaw in the old style, 3 horizontal lines the war chief's house. She had known, in the part of her that tracked such things without being asked, that this was coming. She had not known it would come this soon. She set the heifer's leg down gently and walked out of the barn. Callan was already on the porch. He had come out of the house with his coffee mug, which meant he heard the horse and come to the door the way he did everything, without urgency, without theatre, just present. He stood with the mug in both hands, watched the steam rising in the cold air, and watched the rider come. The rider stopped at the edge of the yard and did not dismount. "This the Durst property?" His voice was even, professional. "It is," Callan said. "Callan Durst." That's right." The rider looked at Vora. She looked back at him. There was a long moment that had nothing in it except recognition. The particular exhaustion of 2 people who have been moving toward the same collision for a long time, and have finally arrived at it. "Sorn," she said. "Vora, Dharma." He reached into the leather satchel at his hip and produced a folded document. "I have a recovery claim filed under the war chief's authority. Debt asset registered to the Harrow Creek placement as of 6 weeks prior." He held the document out, not to her, to Callan. "Yeah, you'll want to read it." Callan set his mug on the porch rail and came down the steps. He took the document and read it. He read it the way he did everything, thoroughly, without expression, taking the time it actually required. Vora watched his face. Nothing moved in it except his eyes, tracking down the page. He looked up. "Says she owes the clan a debt of service, 12 years remaining." "That's correct." "Says the sale to the broker was a lawful conversion of the debt." "Do also correct, E." Callan looked at the document again. "Doesn't say what the debt was for." Sorn's expression didn't change. "Or the nature of the original debt isn't relevant to the recovery claim." "Seems like it might be," Callan said. He folded the document and held it at his side. Vora came off the porch and stood in the yard. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, was flat and entirely empty of anything that could be used against her. The war chief filed the claim himself. "Through the clan's legal office." "Yes." "How long ago?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She had been here 6. He had waited 3 weeks before filing, which meant he had spent 3 weeks deciding whether to file at all, which meant he was not certain the claim would hold. She filed this away and kept her face still. "You can come willingly," Sorn said. He was not unkind. That was the thing about Sorn. He had never been unkind, not once in the 12 years she had known him, and it had never once made him less dangerous. "Or I file the formal recovery notice with the Tallow River Settlement Office. They have 10 days to comply before I can act on the claim directly." He looked at her steadily. "I'll give you until morning." He made camp at the edge of the property, past the south fence line, with the courteous efficiency of a man who understood that his presence was already an imposition and saw no reason to make it worse. Vora watched him go from the yard. Callan stood beside her, still holding the document. "He come inside," he said. She did. The kitchen was warm. Pip lifted his head from the rag rug by the stove, looked at Vora's face, and put his head back down without moving. She went to the shelf where she kept the broker's original paperwork. She had kept it there since the first week, folded inside the account ledger, because she had always known it might matter, and she brought it to the table and spread it out. Callan sat across from her. He looked at the papers. Then he stood up, picked up his chair, and moved it around to her side of the table. He sat down beside her. He did not explain this. He pulled the recovery claim from his pocket and laid it next to the broker's contract and looked at both of them. "Can't tell me what I'm looking at, he said. She told him. The debt asset sale required 2 elder witnesses at the time of conversion. That was clan law, older than the war chief, older than his father. The paperwork was stamped. The process had not been followed. The elders had not been present. She knew this because she had been there, and she knew the names of the 3 elders who should have been summoned and were not. Callan was quiet for a moment. "Can they verify it?" "I have someone ask them." She looked at the papers, and I never thought anyone would ask. He found the pencil. It was in his shirt pocket this time. He had put it there after the last time he'd needed it, and spent 10 minutes searching the kitchen. He pulled it out and set it on the table between them. "Write the names down." She wrote them. Her crooked fingers moved across the paper without hesitation, the letters precise and even, the way they always were when she was most afraid. Callan read the names. He read the recovery claim again. He read the broker's contract. He sat with all of it for long enough that the coffee on the stove went cold, and Vora did not rush him, because she had learned that Callan Durst's silences were not empty. Outside, through the kitchen window, Sawn's campfire was a small orange point in the dark at the edge of the property. It burned steadily in the windless cold. Vora looked at it and looked away. Callan got up without speaking and went to the stove. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, reheated from the morning, not good coffee, just hot, and set one in front of her. He sat back down beside her. He picked up the pencil. "Start from the beginning," he said. "The elder law, all of it. I want to write it down while you talk." She looked at him, his shaking hands wrapped around the pencil, and held it steady by an act of will she had watched him perform every morning for 6 weeks. He was looking at the paper, not at her, waiting. She started from the beginning. The fire outside did not go out. She packed the way she did everything, methodically, without sentiment. The medicine satchel first. Boy, because it was the most organized and would tell her if she was rushing. She was not rushing. Each packet of dried herb went into its sleeve, each roll of clean linen into its place, the small bone-handled knife into the loop at the side. Her hands moved in the dark without needing light. They knew this work. The room was cold. She had not lit the lamp. Her pack came next. The spare shirt, the second pair of wool socks, the whetstone wrapped in the oilcloth, the account ledger she'd been keeping for Callan, the one she'd started without being asked, tracking the feed costs and the fence materials and the projected winter shortfall. She left on the small table beside the bed. He would need it. He would not know he needed it until spring, but he would need it. She smoothed the cover once with her palm and left it, and the willow bark was on the kitchen shelf. She told herself she would not take it. It was his shelf, his kitchen. The jar had been left by Della Marsh for reasons that were nobody's business but Della's, and taking it would be taking something that did not belong to her. She stood in the doorway of her room and looked at the dark kitchen, and thought about her fingers, which had already begun to ache in the cold the way they always did before a hard frost. She thought about the ride ahead of her, however long it was, and the morning after that, and the one after that. She crossed the kitchen and took the willow bark off the shelf and put it in her satchel. Practical. That was all. The note took 4 attempts. The first 3 said too much. The fourth said, "The broker's contract is paid through the month. I am not leaving the work undone. I'm leaving before I become a problem that costs you something you cannot afford to lose." She read it once, folded it, and set it on the table beside the pencil. The pencil he'd had trouble finding the first night. The pencil he'd found faster the second time, when it mattered more. She did not look at the shelf where the 2 plates lived. Outside, the cold hit her face like a flat hand. The frost was already down. She could feel it through her boot soles. The ground gone hard and indifferent. Sawn's campfire was a dim orange point at the far edge of the property, low now, banked for sleeping. She gave it one look and turned away from it, toward the south pasture trail. Her green skin held the cold differently than human skin did. She had learned this early, the way the chill settled into her more slowly, but stayed longer, the way her body ran warmer at the core and colder at the extremities, the way her tusks ached in hard frost, the way some people's teeth ached. She flexed her crooked fingers inside her gloves and kept walking. The south pasture fence materialized out of the dark ahead of her. 3 new posts, the ones they'd set together 6 weeks ago. She could tell them from the old ones by the way they stood, plumb and solid where the old posts had developed a lean. She had held each one while he tamped the earth around the base. She had not thought about that at the time. She was thinking about it now, which was a problem. She stopped at the fence, not because she had decided to stop. Her body stopped and she was inside it, and it would not move. She stood with her pack on her back and her satchel over one shoulder and her crooked fingers wrapped around the top rail, and she looked out at the frost-killed pasture grass and tried to locate the part of herself that was good at leaving. It was there. She knew it was there. She had used it before, had walked away from the Clan's hall with 2 broken fingers and a broker's hand on her arm, and had not looked back, had not made a sound, had filed the experience underdone and moved forward. She knew how to leave. She had left before. The fence rail was cold under her hands. She understood, with the precision she brought to everything, what was actually happening. She was not leaving to protect him from the cost of her. That was the story she had written in the note, and it was true as far as it went, but it did not go far enough. She was leaving because she did not want to. She was leaving because she had noticed 3 weeks ago that she did not want to, and had said nothing, and had kept noticing, and had kept saying nothing, and now Sawn was camped at the edge of the property with his stamped paperwork and his procedural courtesy, and she had run out of time to keep saying nothing. Wanting things was a liability. She had learned this at cost. Wanting things from a man who still set a plate for a woman 2 years in the ground. That was not a liability. That was a debt she had no right to run up. She stood at the fence and did not move. The frost came down around her. She could feel it settling on her coat, on the back of her neck, on the ridge of her brow. Her breath made small clouds and disappeared. But the pasture was silent except for the distant sound of the cattle shifting in the barn, the low occasional sound of an animal resettling its weight. She had checked the heifer's fetlock yesterday. Sound. Fully healed. She had noted it in the ledger she'd left on the table. She was still standing at the fence when she heard the porch door. Not loud, not urgent. Just the particular sound of a door opened by someone who had been awake for a while and was not surprised by the cold. Footsteps on the frost-hard ground, unhurried. She did not turn around. She heard him stop somewhere behind her. Not close, not at the fence, just present in the dark the way a person is present when they are not trying to crowd you. Then her name. Once. Quiet. Not a question. Not a command. Just her name. Said in the dark. Led by a man whose shaking hands had moved his chair to her side of the table without explanation, who had found the pencil faster the second time who had not once in 6 weeks asked her to explain her crooked fingers or her flat voice or the way she checked the window before she put her pack down. She did not turn around. He did not come closer. The frost settled. The cattle shifted. Sawn's fire had gone to coals at the edge of the dark. Vora stood at the fence she had helped build, with the willow bark in her satchel and the note on the table, and her crooked fingers wrapped around the cold rail, and she stayed exactly where she was. The cold had settled into the ground the way cold does when it means to stay, not the sharp cold of a single night, but the kind that works down through the soil and makes the frost permanent by morning. Vora stood at the south pasture fence with her pack on her back and her crooked fingers wrapped around the top rail, and she did not move when she heard his boots on the frozen grass behind her. He said her name once, just the one syllable, flat and careful, the way you'd speak near something that might bolt. She did not turn around. The frost had come up through the rail into her fingers while she'd been standing there. She could feel the ache of it in the two that had healed wrong, the deep bone ache that the willow bark helped but did not fix. She had the willow bark in her pack. She had taken it. She was still not sure what that meant about her. Callan did not come closer. He stopped somewhere behind her and to the left. She could place him by the sound of his breathing in the cold air, or the small cloud of it, and he was quiet for long enough that she thought he might just stand there until one of them made a decision. Then he said, "Rich, I wrote it out." She heard paper. She turned because the paper was information, and information was something she could deal with. He was holding a folded sheet in both hands. His hands were shaking, the morning shake, the one that had nothing to do with cold, and he had them wrapped around the paper the way he wrapped them around his coffee mug, waiting for the tremor to pass. He did not look embarrassed about it. He had stopped being embarrassed about it somewhere in the last several weeks, or perhaps he had simply stopped noticing that she noticed. "Her settlement office," he said. "A procedural challenge. The elder witness requirement you told me about." He held the paper out. "And I wrote down what you said. Best I could. You'll need to correct it." She took the paper. "Read it." Her eyes moved through it once, fast, then again slower. He had gotten the procedural language wrong in 2 places, and the jurisdictional framing was off. But the argument was sound. The core of it was sound. And he had found the right statute number, which meant he had ridden to the settlement office at some point in the last 12 hours and asked someone, which meant he had done this before she woke up, before she packed her bag, before she made her decision in the dark. "When did you go to town?" she said. It was not a question. "Last night." He paused. "After you went to bed." She looked at him. He was in his coat, the worn one with the collar that didn't sit right, and his boots were still muddy from the road. He had not slept. She could see that in the set of his jaw, the particular flatness around his eyes that was not his grief. Flatness, but something else. The look of a man who had been working a problem through the night and had arrived at the only answer that made sense to him. "The North Land," she said. "The lease income's enough to hire an advocate." He said it the way he said most things. The essential fact, nothing around it. "I haven't touched it in 3 years. I'm touching it now." She looked back at the paper. Her thumb moved over the statute number. He had written it in the same careful, slightly cramped hand as the not-quite contract they'd signed on her first night. The pencil pressed hard enough to leave a groove in the paper. "This framing is wrong," she said. "The challenge has to be filed under clan compact law and not settlement jurisdiction. Sawn is operating under the compact. You have to meet him in his own framework." "Or can you fix it?" "Yes." "Then let's go inside." She looked at him for a moment, at his shaking hand still holding the shape of the paper she'd taken, at the mud on his boots, at the fact that he had ridden to town in the dark for a statute number. She picked up her pack. She followed him back across the frost-hard ground toward the house. Sorn read the revised filing twice. He was sitting at the kitchen table. Callan had offered, Vora had not objected, and Sorn had accepted with the courtesy of a man who understood that courtesy was its own kind of pressure. And he read with the focused quiet of someone who takes paperwork seriously, because paperwork is the only weapon he trusts. Vora stood near the stove. She watched his eyes move across the page. He set it down. He looked at her. "The elder witness clause," he said. "The convening was not completed before the sale was filed," she said. "The stamp is dated. The convening record is dated. There is a 4-hour gap. Inch. The war chief will say the convening was waived." The war chief can say that to the 3 elders who were present and did not waive it. Sorn was quiet. He looked at the paper again, not reading it this time, just looking at it the way you look at a door that has turned out to be locked. He was not a cruel man. She had known that from the first morning. It did not make him less dangerous, but it made him readable, and readable was something she could work with. 30 days, he said finally. A minimum for the review. Okay, I know. He stood. He picked up his satchel and settled it across his shoulder with the careful habit of a man who has carried it a long time. He looked at her with something that was not quite respect and not quite apology, and landed somewhere between them. "You were always better at the accounts than anyone," he said. She said nothing. He nodded once, to her and then to Callan, and he walked out. Through the window, she watched him break his camp at the edge of the property, with the same unhurried efficiency he'd arrived with. The second horse went with him. Empty. Callan made dinner. He moved through the kitchen with the quiet certainty of a man in the one room where he still knew where everything was. And Vora sat at the table and did not offer to help, because he had not asked, and she had learned what that meant. He set 2 plates. He did not put one away. They ate. The food was plain and hot, and there was enough of it, and neither of them talked about Sorn, or the filing, or the 30 days, because those things existed and would continue to exist, and there was nothing more to say about them tonight. After, she washed the plates and he stood beside her with a dish towel. And somewhere in the middle of this, her hands in the water, his hands waiting, he said quietly that he would like her to stay past the 30 days. He said it was not about the legal situation. He started the next sentence and did not finish it. He found the word that mattered and stopped there. "He stay," he said. She held a wet plate. She looked at her crooked fingers wrapped around it, the 2 that had healed wrong, the ones that ached in the cold, the ones she flexed every morning before she started work. She had carried those fingers through 3 owners, and 1 broker, and 4 miles of dry grass dark, and 1 pre-dawn walk to a fence she had helped build. They were not fixed. They still worked. "Broke things still run," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be fixed. I'm asking you to stay." She put the plate on the shelf. She did not answer immediately. She picked up the next plate and held it out to him. He took it. He dried it. He put it on the shelf beside the first one. That was the answer. In the morning, she came in from the barn to find her room changed. The windowsill, the one she had pressed her hand against on the first night, testing whether it would hold, had been replaced. New wood, properly fitted, be painted the same color as the wall. The window was open so she could see it from outside before she came in. Callan was not in the room. He did not mention it at breakfast. She ran her fingers along the new wood. It was smooth and solid, and smelled of fresh paint, and something underneath that, sawdust, and the particular cold morning smell of the ranch, which she had learned without meaning to. She closed the window against the frost. She went to start the day's work. By evening, the barn check was done, the herd was settled, and the heifer's fetlock, the one she had treated on her first morning, the one that had been swollen and hot and wrong, was sound under her fingers, healed. She pressed along the joint and felt nothing but good solid bone and the heifer's impatience to be left alone. Callan fastened the barn latch. His hands shook slightly and then steadied, the way they always did. Pip moved between them in the slow, deliberate way of a very old dog who had made this decision weeks ago and had simply been waiting for the humans to arrive at the same conclusion. He settled near the barn door with a sigh that communicated clearly that it had taken them long enough. The frost was on the water trough. The barn held the warmth of the animals inside it. Outside, the dry grass country had gone dark and iron cold, the way it did when it meant to stay that way. Neither of them was whole. Both of them were running. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.